Yeah.
Well, everyone, welcome back to a very exciting episode of the Storybox podcast. Today, my friends, we need to rethink the conversation around mental health, and we're going to do that today with my guest, Lucy Foulkes. Now, for those of you that don't know who she is, she's an academic psychologist conducting research about mental health and social development, particularly in adolescence. She's got a new book that she's working on currently about teenage adolescence, which I think is going to be a fascinating read. She's just told me a moment ago she's interviewing people, which is pretty cool. I get a behind the scenes sort of sneak peek, I guess, not really about, all that sort of stuff. But anyway, she's a senior research fellow at Anna Freud National Centre for Children and Families and an honorary lecturer in psychology at UCL. She has an extensive experience in public science communication nationally and internationally. She has a book called Losing Our Minds, which is about reshaping the conversation around mental health, the science, and what it really is and what it's not. And you can go and get a copy of that book wherever books are sold. Lucy, can I welcome you so much to the Storybox podcast today?
Yes. Hi, Jay. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Now, like I said just a second ago, we need to reshape the conversation around mental health, and we're going to do that in just a minute. But before we do that, my very first question for you is, what does success look like for you?
Oh, gosh, that's a big thing. I guess doing interesting work that I find interesting, but that also makes some sort of impact. So that, I find it very rewarding when I know that people have read the book or read some work that I've done and found it helpful, or that it's changed the way that they think in some way. So I think, for me, doing that at scale is obviously nice and one form of success. But even if I do it with one person, I find that, it sort of makes all the work that goes into the book worthwhile.
Did you ever think that you would write a book on mental health?
I thought that I'd write a book since I was about 5. I just always, and I think a lot of writers probably say this, that they just kind of were always a writer and they always had it in them. So I always wanted to write a book. And I wrote a novel first. That was initially what I was interested in, but I wrote the whole thing, but it just didn't go anywhere. And then I was working by then as an academic psychologist, getting very interested in mental health. And I thought, actually, maybe what I should be doing is writing a nonfiction book. So I did that, and I was like, I'll come back to the novel bit, but I don't know if I will now. But it was always in me, I think.
Was it hard for you to write a book on mental health?
It's hard. Yes, it was hard. You've got to get it right. So you've got to be very careful about the research that you're writing about, and that you don't miss something out, and that you don't piss someone off whose work you've described. You don't miss something obvious. So a lot of the challenge was about reading, getting the tone right. As we'll talk about, like, some of the stuff I say is quite sensitive and potentially critical. So I was anxious about it coming out that it would be misperceived or criticized. So a lot of effort went into that side of it. And it's just a big old piece of work to wrangle with in your head. It's not like an essay where you've got a few thousand words. You're trying to think about the structure across 80,000 words, and that's difficult.
I want to get into sort of the process a little bit later, but you've got this incredible book. So later on, it was published in hardback, I believe, as Losing Our Minds. And then it was originally published as What Mental Health Really Is and What It Really Isn't.
Other way around.
The other way around. So what mental health really is and what it isn't. So, what mental health really isn't. Sorry. And I think I got it butchered. I'll let you say what it is.
It used to be called Losing Our Minds, What Mental Illness Really Is and What It Isn't. And I really liked the title of Losing Our Minds. Thought it was quite clever. But they wanted to repackage it a bit for the paperback. And so their suggestion was to Losing Our Minds and make the subtitle the title. So now it's just called What Mental Illness Really Is and What It Isn't.
So when we are talking about the whole topic of mental health, everyone's got mental health. Is that correct?
Yeah, in the same way that everyone has physical health. So it's a bit of people say that it's a bit of a sort of nothingy phrase. I mean, it's like everybody has, I don't know, a body. It's just the question becomes more interesting about to what extent do people have problems with their mental health and how common is that? But yeah, everyone has a sort of concept of mental health, I guess.
Did you discover how many mental health issues there actually are?
It's sort of an unanswerable question because it depends how you define mental health issues. And I think this is a big part of the problem at the moment. So really commonly thrown around stat, often in these kind of awareness campaigns, is that 1 in 4 people will have will meet criteria for a mental disorder in any given year. Even that is a bit tricky because some people in a study might meet criteria for a disorder, but actually they're not. If you were a clinician and you assessed them, they're not sufficiently distressed to really warrant that disorder. So that might be an overestimate. But then actually, if you think about just general things like distress and anxiety, it's going to be way higher than 1 in 4. It's probably going to be everyone a bit across a whole year. So it's a difficult question, and it depends on how you're defining mental health issue, which is sort of undefinable.
So how do we know that we've got a mental health condition per se? Like, is it more about the diagnosis that we get from our doctor? Can we self-diagnose, or does it have to be from a doctor?
Self-diagnosis is risky in the same way that it would be risky to try and self-diagnose with a physical condition, like diabetes or cancer, although you could certainly have a hunch that you might have a problem. But yeah, self-diagnosis is definitely happening much, much more now because of all this awareness that we've been, all these campaigns that have been telling us to notice these problems. So self-diagnosis is really common and really understandable. But I would, encourage caution, if you are concerned that you have a mental health condition or disorder, that it's useful to go and talk to a professional.
What are the main sort of mental health conditions that you discovered that sort of plague most people in the world? Is it more depression, anxiety, those sort of things?
So anxiety and depression are the 2 common ones. But both of them, like all mental health conditions, exist on a spectrum. So everyone in the world will be somewhere on this scale between, so take anxiety, for example. Some people will experience it as a kind of mild, transient emotion. And gradually, as you move up that spectrum, you might start to experience it more often, experience it at a greater severity, find it more difficult to control, find it more distressing, and also importantly in terms of understanding whether you've moved into the threshold of what we might call a disorder. It starts to affect your ability to live, to function in your daily life. But the trouble is that lots of people experience lots of temporary anxiety and mild anxiety, which is really unpleasant and difficult and needs to be paid attention to. But it's not necessarily useful to conceptualize that as a disorder. And the same with depression. Everyone has sort of temporary periods of low mood. But once you get up into the high end, the disorder end, it's much more than mood. It's actually quite a physical disorder. And it's about hopelessness and inability to experience pleasure. But again, all of these things exist on a spectrum that we'll all sit somewhere on and move around. There's not a binary between having a disorder and not having a disorder.
When we are looking at that spectrum, from someone that is really, really bad with depression and with severe anxiety compared to someone that isn't, why is that the case? Why does it fluctuate from person to person?
As in, what causes it in the first place?
So what causes it in the first place? And then why does it sort of like, is it individualized? So one person suffers with it more than, say, another person does, like the symptoms of it?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different answers to that question. And depending on who you speak to, they'll put different emphasis on different things. But the way I understand it from the evidence we've got is that you will have some sort of biological genetic vulnerability to feeling these experiences. Yeah. But that will also interact with what's happening in the real world. So in terms of the level of difficult things that happen to you, the stress that happens to you, the traumatic events that happen to you, the amount of social support that you have, whether you're being bullied, etc. And then also how you navigate and deal with those events. So there's biology, there's psychology, there's the environment, and everyone has different setups for all three of those things.
Yeah. And how do we, so if we were to say treat someone that is on the higher spectrum, the worse off one, do we go into more the medication first, or do we try and help them with some other strategies and then move into the medication first? Does that sort of work better?
Yeah, it's interesting. It depends on the person and on the healthcare system. So in the UK, at least, the advice for example, for mild to moderate anxiety and depression, so not right up at the extreme end of the spectrum, is that you would try self-help first and psychological therapy first. And then if that doesn't work, you would step up and try medication. So that's the kind of ideal model. But unfortunately, what often ends up happening is when the resources are limited, so there's long waiting lists for therapy, for example, what you see happening is that in some cases, the pills get handed out as a first port of call. And there's been some criticism of that. Although equally, you could also argue, you as a medical professional, you want and need to offer some help. So if the therapy's not there, then you can see why they offer alternatives. So there's the kind of idealized version of treatment, and there's the reality within the system you're working with. But I don't know what the equivalent is like in Australia. I think you have private healthcare, right?
We do, yes. Is that same with Britain as well?
No. So so some people, like if you work for a big corporation, and certain companies will offer private healthcare, or you could pay for it yourself, but it's expensive and unusual to do that. Generally, if people have private healthcare, they'll do it through their company. So most people are reliant on the NHS, which is free, which is free at the point of seeking help. You pay for it through your taxes, but the demand is too strong and there's not enough money. So lots of people are being failed by the NHS at the moment.
Would you consider, say, someone having an addiction to something part of mental health?
Yeah, so that's a big question. I don't know that much about addiction, to be honest, because it's a slightly separate area to what I've worked on. But there's a big debate about the usefulness of framing addiction as a disorder. There are some benefits in that it removes blame from that individual in terms of how they understand themselves, but also how their family and employee, for example, behave towards them. But it can be problematic as well, because it might make people think, and the evidence shows that if you assume something as a disorder, then you think people are less likely to get better, for example. So, and some people don't like framing it as a disorder, because a lot of the reasons that lead people to become addicted is because their lives are incredibly difficult. So it feels a bit unfair to just call it as, something wrong with their brain, when it's actually probably something going on in the outside world. But that's about the extent of my knowledge on addiction.
How about loneliness? Is that part of it?
There's been quite a lot of attention on loneliness recently. I think it was like the theme of some recent campaign over here. I mean, it's not a disorder, but it's associated with things like anxiety and depression. So if you're lonely, you're more likely to feel depressed. And if you're depressed, you're more likely to feel lonely. Yeah. Loneliness is really interesting because it's a subjective state. So it's not about literally how many people do you have in your social circle. It's how alone do you feel? How supported do you feel? So you might have quite a lot of social contacts, but still feel lonely. And obviously it was a really interesting construct in the pandemic.
Yeah.
Talking about loneliness. Yeah.
Because if we were to speak about the lack of connection that a lot of people had during the pandemic, I mean, there's a form of connection through Zoom, but it's not the same as like being in person. with people. Like there's a kinetic energy, right? Like it's really, really infectious. And you can feel it when two people are together in a room having a deep and meaningful conversation. I mean, we're having a connection at the moment through Zoom, but it's just not the same as if we were actually in person. So, I mean, the rate of people complaining of not being able to see their friends or family members during the pandemic just went crazy. And how do we mend that? Because we've got this massive hole that we've dug. Is there a way to sort of dig ourselves out of that hole?
Well, I guess even that's an open question. Like, are we still in the hole, or were we in it temporarily and now we're out of it again? I think it's like evidence-wise, we still don't really know about the long-term psychological effects of the pandemic. And there's quite a few interesting studies showing that the mental health sort of fluctuated along with the state of lockdown that we were in. So like when you first went into lockdown, anxiety increased, but then it actually sort of leveled off and calmed down. Yeah. Although the mood was worse in lockdown, but then it improved again. So yeah, optimistically, I might think maybe it's, we're not still stuck in the hole because we've been able to climb out of it now. But I think the long-term consequences might be more in terms of economic impact and lost education and that kind of thing.
It kind of felt like we're on this pendulum swing in a way. So one moment it's sort of leveling out, the next minute it's going up, and then back we go. It
felt like that. So we had a second lockdown in January last year. And I think in the few months preceding that, everyone thought no one imagined we'd go back again into lockdown. And that was a real, a difficult moment, that announcement.
We had ours in June, I think, of last year. And that got honestly the worst lockdown of the two. It was, I don't know if you heard too much about what happened in Sydney and Melbourne.
Melbourne, because I had some colleagues there at the time. Yeah. But vaguely. My friends, I can't remember the sequence of events, but Sydney were in lockdown for a long time as well, right?
We were in lockdown, I think, the second one for over 4 months.
Yeah.
Which was just a long time. Yeah. To be in crazy isolation, and it was tough. I'm not gonna lie, but I guess this leads to my question of mental resilience. Like, how do we build our mental health in the form of being more resilient to when, say, for example, these challenges do come in our life, that we can resist getting or falling into depression and anxiety? Is that even possible?
Sometimes, depends on who you are, and how vulnerable you were to start off with, and all sorts of things. I think some of the suggestions about how to be more resilient are just fundamentally more difficult for some people to implement, just because of the way their brains and their minds work. Like one basic thing so it's a lot about coping. So how do you cope when something difficult happens? And there are sort of healthy coping strategies and less healthy or helpful ones. And so one healthy one, for example, would be like reaching out for social support, or a thing called cognitive reframing, which is basically how do you try and talk to yourself about the problem in a more positive, hopeful kind of way. Yeah. So that is a part of resilience, but some people will just find it much more difficult to do that reframing, because it's just harder when you're already depressed, for example, or they don't have the social context to reach out to.
When you were in your second lockdown, how did you help your own mental health?
I think I was pretty lucky, to be honest. And one really important thing is that lockdown didn't affect everyone in the same way. And some people liked it, which no one really talks about in the media. But for some people, it removed a lot of stress from their lives, especially if they had enough money and lived in a nice home and can work from home, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like I really can't complain all that much. I was bored. I found it very boring and I missed people a lot. Just what everyone else did, just tried to stay in contact via the internet. And it's interesting what you're saying, like it just is not the same, but it's also better than nothing.
Yeah.
So, did a lot of socializing via Zoom, which is obviously a poor substitute, but it gives you a little, it gives you enough of a kick of socializing to help. I guess I just relied on that a lot and just got into a routine of this sort of simple, boring, but quite low stress days.
You sort of get into that sort of lockdown routine, and then when it's all said and done and we're sort of meant to be jolted back into the new normal, it's sort of like, oh, okay, I've got to adjust again. All right, let's go.
Yeah, for some people coming out of it was the stressful bit.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting stuff about teenagers. About a third of them said that they preferred lockdown to their life before lockdown, which is really revealing in terms of, understanding what was going wrong at school that meant they were happier being at home with their families. But actually for a lot of them, it was much less stress. They could just, figure out for them, especially like A-level, 17, 18-year-old students, they could figure out their own work schedule. They could sleep more. A lot of them said, they didn't have to get up really early to go to school. You can maintain friendships online, do some hobbies, spend more time with your family. So it's interesting that, the teenagers who quite liked it. And then actually the hard bit for them was having to go back to school.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's been it's weird. Sometimes it wasn't that long ago, but to look back on it and think, I can't believe we did that for so long.
Yeah. 2 years.
Yeah.
Nuts.
I know. And everyone did it. That's what's so weird, the universal nature of it. You would have a call like we're doing now, someone on the other side of the world. And we all did it.
And now we can travel again. I mean, that was something when we're actually in it, we thought we'd never be able to do for a long time.
For people who were like separated from family and stuff.
Yeah. And you got to see all those videos of the reuniting of friends and family. It was a beautiful moment. But I felt like during that whole period, there was a lot of negative information being produced. Like you just had to turn off the TV all the time because it got so annoying. And what that does to obviously your mental health is just not a good thing. And for young people especially. And I guess it led me to the question of when we are talking about the conversation about surrounding mental health, kids' mental health, for example, versus adult mental health, what do we specifically need to reshape or reframe the narrative regarding kids and adult mental health?
So I'm particularly interested in adolescent bits, so teenagers at school and at university. But I think this applies to everyone. The balance that we need to get right is how to get help to the people who need it, to the people who are at the more severe end of the spectrum. So promote awareness of these concepts and how to get help, but without accidentally sending the message to everyone else that any sign of mental distress is a problem or a sign of a disorder. And this is where things are really going wrong, especially amongst young people, is that they're now, because it's not their fault, this is what they're being told from all these campaigns, is that they're now interpreting all kinds of lower level problems as, potential anxiety disorders, for example, which then actually become self-fulfilling.
Yeah.
That's the bit that I'm worried about.
Is that the same for adults or just for adolescents?
Yeah, the attention has been much more in young people, and that's kind of where I've focused and where my sort of theories are about that age group, because so much of these awareness campaigns are targeted towards them. I think it's relevant for adults too, probably less so older adults.
Yeah. You think, Sorry, keep going. I interrupted.
No, that's it. It's people. Yeah, I would say, when I think about this, I'm particularly thinking about maybe people going up to their 30s, but I don't know, this is just a hypothesis. I don't really know yet.
Would you say that mental health for young people is going to continue to get worse over the next couple of years? Or do you think it's going to be better?
Well, I think if it continues on the trajectory that it's already on, then yes. You're seeing this gradually increasing reporting of self-harm, anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms. And there's lots of reasons why, sort of legitimate reasons why those things might be getting worse. But I'm also interested in the possibility that the way we're talking about things is actually contributing and exacerbating the sense that things are getting worse, because people now are much more willingly interpreting and reporting things as problems when an equivalent person wouldn't have done in the past.
Right. So we need to change the narrative.
Yeah. Sure. I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, that seems to be the big question, doesn't it? Like, how do we fix a problem that we sort of have amplified in many ways?
Yeah, exactly. And I've been asked in another interview, someone said, don't you think it's too late? Like, the cat's out of the bag now kind of thing. You can't rein it back in. And I think that's really interesting, especially in terms of if you share awareness of things like social anxiety disorder and PTSD, and people self-diagnose with those things. It's when perhaps they are not bad enough to fully meet that criteria, but they are in distress and they need noticing and they need help. It's very difficult to pull that label away from someone, because it provides meaning. It helps them understand their problem. It helps them communicate their distress. If you rip that away from someone, then you're potentially sort of, in a culture where we only take distress seriously if it has a name, then you're potentially invalidating the distress of that person to tell them not to use that language. So this is the challenge about how do we promote the idea that all levels of distress and difficulty are real and deserve, kindness and validating and support. But we shouldn't frame all of them as a psychiatric, difficulty, mental disorder.
When you were researching for the book, was there anything that sort of surprised you at all?
Something that's interesting is that a few of the studies tracking rates of mental health problems across time show that they've increased, but not increased that much, like not increased as much as the media would have you believe. So that's interesting. Like, why are we so fixated on the idea that everything's awful and everything's unwell, everyone's unwell? And another interesting thing is if you go back in time to see historically how often each generation believes that their generation is in a fresh crisis. Even from kind of the 1900s, they were worried that there was an epidemic of nervousness and anxiety because of, this new fast pace of life that had been brought about because of industrialization. So that's really interesting, because it tells you there's some sort of strange appeal in believing that we're a generation in crisis and that things are uniquely difficult for us now than relative to anyone in the past. So I think that plays into it, this narrative, this sort of strangely tempting narrative that we're all unwell. But I don't think it's helpful for the individual.
Seems to me like if we got rid of the media, we'd be in a lot better situation. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, the trouble is that the media, in terms of reporting mental health stories, it's in their interest for things to be a crisis because it makes a more interesting story.
Yeah.
So, they will go with the headline that makes things sound as bad as possible, or they will, pluck out the statistic that makes it sound as bad as possible. And this is where people get their information. So people start believing that there's a mental health crisis because the newspapers said that there were. You can't get rid of it altogether. I think, maybe you just need to promote a bit of healthy skepticism around what you read and be aware that some newspapers, all of them, I suppose, will deliberately frame things to sell papers and to get clicks online.
Yeah. And is there anything that we can do, like any strategies that you recommend in the book to guard our mental health?
Or mental health in general, or the media stuff?
or mental health in general. I mean, media is one thing, and then we've got social media, which is another thing, but there are other areas too.
It's so individual. And I think a lot of it, unfortunately, is about sort of trial and error and figuring out what works for you. I'm a big advocate of personally just changing how your body feels and a knock-on effect that has. So exercise is the obvious one, and sleep and the food that you eat. I find it much easier to do something with my body that then will have a knock-on effect on how I feel mood-wise than to sit down and try and change the way I feel, the way I think when I feel crap. So, but equally, lots of people are so unwell that doesn't help. You can't recommend that everyone just exercises because some problems and disorders are just far too big for that. And then they need more professional intervention. So it depends.
Yeah. I mean, I struggle with my own mental health for a long period of time, and exercise helps keep those demons at bay for the most part. But then there are other things that I do, like eating proper foods and having proper connections with people, trying to stay away from the media as much as I can and not get sucked into that world. But yeah, I think everyone has their low days, and in those low days, it's really, really important to pick yourself up as best as you possibly can with those strategies so that you don't make things worse for yourself. And we can be our own worst enemy, can't we, Lucy, in those moments? So
yes, definitely. I think, what you say about social stuff is really important. Like, I think at the moment, the way we talk about mental health is often about what can we do personally within the individual to help in terms of exercise or mindfulness or whatever, or let's go to a professional and what can a professional do? But we kind of forget a third option, which is about social support and what we can do for each other and how powerful that is. I'm also I always have to tell myself this because I believe in the principle, but I'm not very good at tolerating it. The idea that things just pass and get better with time, and that often you just have to sit it out and you can't make it better in that moment. Which has proven to be, and it just does get better, which has proven to be true so many times in my own life. But then each time something comes up, I have to remind myself of it again. So often, there is this temptation. I need to do something. I need to correct it. I need to look after myself. I need to make it go away. But actually, you can't eradicate all of it. And often some of it is just involves sitting with it and waiting and, looking after yourself while you're waiting, but the accepting that you can't make it go away.
Yeah. This too shall pass.
Yes,
is a good saying.
Exactly.
Lucy, I want to be mindful of your time. So I've got two quick final questions for you, if that's all right. People can get your book wherever books are sold, which is honestly an incredible read for those people that are wanting to know more about mental health. And the science behind it too. This is a question I'm interested in, but it's a personal question. What do you love the most about yourself and your story?
Ooh. I don't know if I love anything about my story. I don't feel like I learned anything particularly useful from the experience or that I was strengthened from it. It's just something bad that happened that was horrible. So I know there's often a lot of narrative that, I had depression and now I've, been strengthened by it, or there's a lot of narrative as this sort of recovery narrative that it was a sort of, in hindsight, a positive thing to have gone through. And I don't feel like that. I really like the work I'm doing at the moment. I really like thinking about this stuff and writing about it and communicating about it to people. I really like, because it's sort of two separate skill sets. One is to do the research and one is to be able to communicate publicly about it. Academic writing is quite a different beast, and it means a lot of thinking is sort of locked behind academic doors. So I really like being able to do the research and be able to talk about it accessibly. So I guess I would say that.
We definitely need your work. So please continue. And I'm looking forward to the next book that's coming out. This is my favorite question. I love asking all my guests at the very end. It is a hypothetical one, but I want you to imagine with me for a moment that you've been able to reach the age of 100. All your friends and your family have decided to put together a film for you of everything you've ever said and everything you've ever done. Don't ask me how in the world they got it all. We'll call it magic for the sake of argument. But they've been able to get it and show it to you on your 100th birthday. What do you want that film to say and to show about your life?
I suppose, well, two things. One, that I had interesting relationships with people. I'm very interested in, having close relationships with people and how different they can be. Like, you're the same person in each interaction, but that you create something different with each person that you get to know. I really like having, people are just fascinating. I really like knowing people well, and everyone's interesting and all their contradictions and everything. So I guess I would like to have achieved that, but also work. I really find all this stuff fascinating. I want to write more. I want to have a body of work that survives me, I suppose. So I hope that would give me another 66 years from now. So I hope I could write a few more books in that time.
Dr. Lucy Foulkes, thank you so much for your time today, your wisdom, your advice and your stories, and for joining me today on the Storybox podcast.
Thank you for having me.